Let me welcome you all and thank you for being here. It's fantastic to be back. You know how much I love this place. You know how much I love the people on stage today. Bonnie Greer is one of my favorite playwrights. Tim Phillips is one of my favorite human beings, period.
I don't get the human category.
Aminatta Forna is the woman I want to marry, but unfortunately she's married already.
That's after
You
me.
know, one cannot get everything. And you're the best audience, always. So thank you very much for being here.
Questions?
That was it. So what on earth is going on in America? Let me tell you a couple of anecdotes. I lived in America, in the South, in Texas, for 5 years. And I had my first daughter there. She looks a lot like my mother. My father is from African descendants. My mother was blonde, blue-eyed. And my daughter looks a lot like her. So I used to take her, I used to walk in Houston, which nobody does. I used to walk to the park with her. I would put her on my shoulders. And every single time I did that, every single time, a police car would just stop on my side. And the policeman, he was always invariably a policeman, would ask my daughter, is he your dad? And I always wonder what would happen if she says, no. The second anecdote is not as good as that one. The second anecdote, I need to work out, I'm sorry. I just want to let you know that I'm not going to be an impartial.
What's that tattoo?
Oh, that's Cortázar.
Oh, right, okay.
I'll tell you this story. This
Okay.
one is a literary story. The other anecdote is engages a.
We got to compete with that,
I'm just going to roll up my sleeves.
Right.
You have to do it. So this is a T-shirt that a student of mine sent me last week. He was in Charlottesville, and this is what I think of what's going on in America. But I want to read to you the message that he sent me. I do not want it to be soon forgotten that American anarchists and anti-fascists shut down the largest Nazi and white supremacist gathering on US soil in decades. We accomplished this despite being outnumbered, under-equipped, and literally fighting up a hill at great personal risk and at a terrible cost. He's referring to a friend of his, Heather Heyer, who died during the ensuing conflict. What if things had gone differently? He writes, what if we had done as the mayor recommended and stayed away from Emancipation Park so as not to, he quotes the mayor, feed into a cycle of violence? What if the rally had proceeded as planned? What if Nazis and white supremacists had been able to build momentum into the night? Based on what I saw Friday and Saturday, there is no doubt in my mind what would have happened next. They would have terrorized the city of Charlottesville. They would have left their leadership a degree of plausible deniability, broken into smaller groups, and killed and injured any number of people in the centralized locations throughout the city. It was to be their Kristallnacht, the burning cross, the triumphant return. And this is what one of the persons inside the church, someone I respect a lot, Brother Cornel West, had to say about what went down in Charlottesville. We would have been crushed like cockroaches if it were not for the anarchists and the anti-fascists. They saved our lives. Actually, we would have been completely crushed, and I'll never forget that. So, what are we going to do about it?
What would Trump say? He said, Antifa. I mean, when he did his talk. Well, in a way, I know I was even going to say this. I'm not surprised. That's not to say I'm not shocked, but I'm not surprised because I've kind of seen this before. What's different, particularly now, I've never seen anyone marching, the Nazis marching before in America. That's the part I've never seen. I've never seen the torches. I've never heard, Jews.
Tiki torches.
Yeah, well, the
things.
little tiki things. And I've never heard people chanting, Jews will not replace us in the streets. So, I mean, other stuff I've seen, definitely seen before in my lifetime. I mean, what I've written about and I've said it in public and, to literally no response is I think that what these guys were chanting was, you will not replace us. And the you is us. And they know that. And they know that the United States of America is going to be, by 2044, minority majority country. The United Kingdom might be as well. And, people know these things. And this is kind of like the last hurrah of that. And I think history will look back and see that Trump and all of this was, I mean, I'm not being complacent. I'm not being complacent at all, but I'm just sort of trying to look at this in the whole sort of swell of history, that this is a backlash, and this is as violent and nasty as you can get, and it uses the instruments of technology to do it.
So this is not just a chromatist thing. I mean, it's not just about the color of our skin. It's not just about a singularly American problem. It's wider than what is happening over there. As you pointed out, Bonnie, it is, the you is all of us. It is also a matter of power. We're talking about this to Aminatta. But Tim, it was also a matter of history. I find it very interesting that while the 24 or 20 Antifa defenders got around the Thomas Jefferson statue, the Nazis who were marching, and let's just call them by their name.
Oh, they love you too. I mean, that's what they see themselves.
Yeah, they're happy with it.
Yeah, they're very happy with that.
The Nazis who were marching there were there in order to stop, the ghost and the statue of General Robert E. Lee from being taken down. And we know what happened afterwards. What is the role of this imagery, of these particular statues, of these statues, of these narratives of history that one side, the Nazi side, because it wasn't just violence on both sides, as somebody said. What is the role that such stereotypes play in this particular situation, but also in general when it comes to violence?
Well, the first thing is I'm going to keep my shirt on.
Look, I've been working out the whole year
You
just
gotta
for
do
this.
that,
Well, thank you. Two things come to mind on that. The first is most of these statues of Jefferson Davis, Robert Lee, Stonewall Jackson were not put up during the American Civil War in the South. They were not put up just after the Civil War. They were mostly put up in the 20th century. So it tells you that in Baltimore, where they took those down about a week ago, they were put up in the 1930s and 40s, nearly a century after the Civil War ended. And Baltimore was considered the northernmost part of the American Confederacy. And forgive me for saying, it was a big screw you to the African American community
Yep.
and to many others, that you think you defeated us, but you didn't. And, there's been this big debate, what about history? What about heritage? And I would like to ask later my friend from South Africa and others, when apartheid was ended, I don't think I saw statues going up of P.W. Botha or F.W. de Klerk and so forth. There was reconciliation, there was a shared government, but they lost. And there are other things that were being done to recognize, the history, the narrative, what was being lost by the Afrikaner community or the white community. But no statues were going up, and not even 20 years later. And it's undeniable to also recognize, in thinking about history, why did so many Southern whites feel the need to put these up? And I remember writing a piece about a big debate in Northern Ireland a few years ago, when George Bush Jr., the dumber of the two,
when you were going to say the genius.
Yeah.
It's a great painter.
Sent an envoy to Northern Ireland about 8 or 9 years ago, because there were all these fights between Unionists and Republicans about symbols in Northern Ireland. And I remember reading that Richard Haas, who's now president of the Council on Foreign Relations, but was George Bush's envoy, said that maybe the way to deal with this is, and his recommendations were to the government in Northern Ireland, when the Irish president comes to visit, they should fly the Irish flag over Stormont and Belfast City Hall. And huge riots broke out. And I said, here's the thing. These loyalists or unionists who are rioting over the flag are not killing, and they were actually killing a couple of people and putting off bombs, not because of the design of the flag, because of their identities they associate with that flag. People will kill people when identity is tied to symbols. And so the reality is that when you look at the American South, I think these statues have to go. We have to re-engage and contextualize why these were put up, what was the intention of putting these up, but for recognizing they do hold a symbolic hold on people. And I don't mean just the neo-Nazis and the white supremacists, but others. And we need to shift their identities to something less destructive. And I don't know what that answer is.
So in a sense, what you're saying is that we need new images, but we also need a new ceremonial. And here I'm quoting Sylvia Wynter, a fantastic writer, a Caribbean writer, who also points out that after all, we shouldn't forget that this is a matter of power. This is not just some sort of remnant of the past. It's not just some anachronism. As Bonnie just said, they know that by 2040, and actually I remember when I made that statement in my book on what if Latin America ruled the world, I used the most conservative demographic figures. It's going to happen much earlier. They know that is going to happen. So they know that, in a sense, the hold and the privilege they have over resources and so on is coming to an end. So they're lashing out. Okay. But do they have any motivation, Aminatta, just before Bonnie? Do they have, those in power, those who hold this, do they have any motivation to give them?
Do they have any motivation to do things differently? I mean, I'll say that, I now live in the States. I live in Washington, D.C. I've been there for 2 years. We arrived there the week that Trump declared that he was going to run for the Republican nomination. And, I turned to my husband and I went, uh-oh. Right. Because I've seen trouble come. I grew up in a country that went through 25 years of dictatorship. I had a father who was a political activist and fought it and described exactly how this was going to take place in the 1970s, and everything unfolded precisely the way he said it was. It's not that complicated. When countries go down, certain patterns are quite well established. And the reason that I was so fearful when Trump announced that he was going to run and was not laughing. Actually, I don't think a single person of colour in America was laughing about that. But the reason I took it so seriously was because over the last a decade and a half, I've done book tours in America. I do a sort of 10-city, a 2-week tour every sort of 3 years. And I've taught there. I've taught at Williams College in Massachusetts and now in DC. And I lived in California some years ago. And when I tried to explain to my American friends what some of us could see and they couldn't see, the metaphor that I find coming to mind is frogs in water. You know, if you put frogs in water and then you turn up the stove, the heat, the frogs end up dying because they don't realize it's getting hotter and hotter and hotter and hotter. And coming in and out of America, I could feel the temperature rising. I could feel the hate rising. And if anyone, even when Obama was elected, if anyone really thought we'd entered a post-racial society, you know, like everybody else, I was delighted when Obama was elected, like very many people. Some people, of course, didn't like it at all. But I thought, if you don't think that this is going to inflame a proportion of this country, inflame them beyond reason, to see a black man with power. It's about power. And where all that knowledge comes from, those guys marching on the street saying, we will not be replaced, they understand the economics perfectly well. And they understand that they've been getting a free pass perfectly well. And they understand that they have for centuries had people in power who've been making sure that they're all right. And now, not only have they been betrayed by those people, but who are cutting other deals elsewhere in the world, but they can see it all slipping away from them. So, you know, in 2015, when I first got to the States this time round, I had reason to go to South Africa to give a Nadine Gordimer inaugural lecture. And when I was in South Africa, I thought, ooh, America's much more like this. It's much more like South Africa than it is like Europe. So we're always looking at race relations in Europe and comparing them to America, but actually we should be looking at race relations in South Africa and comparing them to America. And I think that where American friends of mine have said to me, oh, we've seen this before, or they talk about Trump's rating, you know, his 30% approval rating. I think now this has gone beyond the democratic process. Right. I think they've gone way beyond that. And something else is happening, and something else is coming, and it's going to be very, very big. And I think they're in the situation South Africa was, really, and they're going to have to start thinking about cutting deals. You know, they're really going to have to start thinking about some very, very strong proactive political and economic shifts. And I'm afraid the Nazis marching are going to have to, I mean, thank goodness it's not my job, but they are going to have to listen to them very plain speaking, and they are going to have to concede some power. If not, I foresee civil conflict, quite serious civil conflict.
Can I just say something that's going to be a little bit counter to my colleagues, and I've written about this and thought about it very deeply. America can't be compared to anywhere else, and I think it's important we don't do that. And let me explain why. James Baldwin said something once, and he said it to, you didn't become white until you came to America, i.e., he said that to Sicilians who were treated like, you know, animals in Italy. He said that to Jews who were chased out of Eastern Europe. He said that to the Irish who were not considered white people in terms of supremacy. He said to the Scots. He said to working class English. The foundation myth of the United States of America is white supremacy. America is a settler nation. And so when you came into America, you became white. So a guy like Stephen Miller, one of Trump's spokespersons, can talk about people speaking English when they come to America, forgetting that his own grandmother came from the Pale. She spoke Yiddish. he forgot he was a Jew. That's a part of what America is about. That is what it is. And the only people who can't become white in America are black people and Native Americans. We can't become white. So that's the first thing that is very unique about the United States of America. And the second thing that's unique about the United States of America and what it holds in common to Germany after World War I is the Abraham Lincoln never called the Civil War Civil War. He considered it sedition. He called it sedition. He suppressed habeas corpus, and he issued an executive order, which we call the Emancipation Proclamation, which obliged Union soldiers to go into the South, go on to plantations, and liberate enslaved people as war collateral. That was all to damage the South and bring them to their knees. He also said at the same time that he wanted to repatriate African Americans because he felt that was the best solution because this is a white country. And the second thing that he wanted to do was to reconcile the United States and the Confederacy as quickly as possible. So he said, Grant said, let them take their horses and their plows back for spring planting. And he did not require a loyalty oath of anyone because these people have been in sedition. The United States is the only country on the face of the earth and in history that has allowed a sedition on its soil to turn into a romance. The Confederate battle flag is a flag of treason. Robert E. Lee and his ancestors will say that to you, committed treason. Now, this is the thing that's unique about the United States. When Lincoln was assassinated, his successor, who's a Southerner, decided to take Reconstruction apart and reconcile the South as quickly as possible. So what the South did right away was make a romance of what they did. Their highest sort of art was to see themselves as a kind of faux Georgian English people. So they went back to that again. Suddenly it was a glorious crusade, a lost cause. You have these things like Zane Grey, you have the Western, the guy who can't go back to his home because the evil people from the North killed it, so he goes out to the West and becomes, the Lone Ranger or whatever. The whole Western is about displaced Southern guys who decide to strike out for the country. That's unique. The correlation between Germany and America is that the Reconstruction, which was to integrate African Americans into the structure of the South, was dismantled in about 5-6 years after that, when states were allowed to interpret the last three, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment of the Constitution. They were allowed personally to interpret it. So what began to happen is Southerners then began to, as I say, romanticize this. They didn't lose this battle. They lost a cause. What happened in Germany after World War I was there was no defeat. There was an armistice. The Germans began immediately to romanticize. There was a thing called the stab in the back. Somebody somewhere, and it was the Jews, that's how they saw it, who actually pulled the rug out from under their noble effort, and that's how they lost. So you see the Germans by 1923 glorifying their battles, glorifying all the things that they had, literally battles they had lost. The South did the same thing in about 1917 when African Americans began to be admitted into the Army of the United States. They created forts in the South, Army bases that were named after Confederate generals. Fort Bragg, all of these places, these are Confederate generals. This is incredibly unique in the history of the whole world. So what we've got now, in a sense, is this whole romanticization of the South. We are the victims, and now we're into white victimhood. These people have taken on the victimization that Southerners have always felt about themselves in relation to the North. I mean, I grew up in the North. My parents were from the South. The teachers the nuns who taught me were from Baltimore, the Oblate Sisters of Providence. They're African-American women who taught enslaved children they could have gone to jail for this. They were Southerners. They called the Civil War the War of Northern Aggression. They never called it the Civil War. It is never called the Civil War. So we go forward into the height of it, a book like Gone with the Wind, a movie like Gone with the Wind, which is the most archetypal American film of all time. And if you can remember, there's a scene in Gone with the Wind. There are two scenes in Gone with the Wind. This is the Southern myth. This is the myth itself. In the scene where at the end of the war, the guys are coming up in the cart looking for the courthouse, and sitting next to this man is a black man. This man has a hat on, he has a suit on, and he's with the guy from the north. That's the evil people. The second thing that happens is when somebody's getting ready to hurt Scarlett, there's a black man there and another black man saves her. He's from the South. And the third thing that happens is when Ashley's getting ready to go off and they don't want to talk about where he's going, where is he going to? A Ku Klux Klan meeting. They say it in the movie, and that's the whole nobility, and that's where we are. That's the battle, and the President of the United States of America has chosen that side, and that's where we are, and this is the final battle.
The other thing about what you correctly call a romance of victimhood is that this romance, which begins as this particular revision of Southern and Northern history in North America and the States, becomes global. Victimhood and victimization, self-victimhood, has become a sort of rule of thumb when it comes to solving conflicts. And the Lincoln model, this turn the page and forget, without any, reparations, without any distinctions, without calling those who were defeated the defeated.
And then he gets assassinated by a white supremacist.
But all of this became the model of international law that was applied after World War II. So what you have said, Bonnie, is incredibly important. But let me ask all of you, two things, starting from what you just said. You have told us, Bonnie, that the imaginary, that romance of the South has become, in a sense, generalized. We no longer recognize it. We're like the frogs in the water. We do not recognize that when we watch W.D. Griffith's Birth of a Nation, that harrowing scene in which the black man appears to be ready to rape the white young woman, who then commits suicide, that romance of martyrdom, then he is taken prisoner by the Ku Klux Klan, and they do justice.
Exactly.
And that's the beginning of the very image of the black man as a dangerous, as a threat.
And the problem is that you're talking about a cinematic masterpiece, as is Gone with the Wind. So they are immortal.
In that sense, they have become are very unconscious.
Yes.
There's a parallel here. Have you read The Sympathizer by Viet Thanh Nguyen? Won the Pulitzer Prize last year. He says something that came to mind when you were talking earlier on. He's actually talking about Vietnam, and he says the first time history's been written by the losers, the history of the Vietnam War. And, what you're talking about with the American South is they are attempting to write their own history and romanticize it, and it has the same elements, the white man as the victim.
Which means, Aminatta, that what we are witnessing has been prepared. I mean, it's been in the works for a very long time. So, for instance, we should call out revisionist historians, some of whom may have been born in this very country, who have been precisely doing that sort of work.
I'd like to think more about the German experience, not post the First World War, but post the Second World War, where there was and continues to be a national conversation
Absolutely.
about culpability and about personal political responsibility. And I wonder if that is in any way possible, how that might look in America, whether we are now, the two sides are so far apart, or whether there's any kind of possibility of
Can that happen, Tim? Do you think that sort of conversation? And the question that I wanted to ask all of you was: do we still have time to prevent the sort of coming conflict that not only Aminatta but many have, are foreseeing?
Well, I'm, as an American from Boston, which I came to learn just 3 years ago, is seen by many people of color outside of Boston as the most racist city in America. And I know personally, having spent 30 years working around the world and trying to resolve conflict, that I went through stages of grief to say, is this real? And I also thought about the experience in working in Northern Ireland, in the Balkans, in South Africa, and in many other countries. And the core of our approach is on shared experience. We're not mediators. We're not coming in with 12 easy steps to yes. We're coming in a much more modest, humble way, saying that people can learn from the experience of others, because people don't respond to repression, humiliation, and exclusion through their national identity card. They respond as humans. And so the core of the approach is, I often say, like a big support group on wheels. We bring people in who've been through it to show people that change is possible. You can make peace with your enemies. You learn to and need to understand the other if you really want to achieve peace. So when I look at my own country today, and I look at the history of racism, and we've started this initiative in Boston, which is, how do you build a more inclusive city? How do you get people and institutions of power and privilege to sort of get it and to really incorporate this? We're looking from the experience around the world. We're even doing this work with behavioral science. But in challenging, the challenge in doing this work is to recognize that we're at a moment in the United States where there are a lot of, and I don't want to say competing pressures, but there's a lot of chaos, crisis, and pressure on the system. When I saw Trump's election, I thought to myself, what really happened there was tectonic plates under the surface that have been shifting and crashing up against each other came to the surface. One of them was about race. One of them was about inequality. One of them was about economic elites seizing the decision-making power of the state over the last 20, 30 years. One of it was the so-called American dream field for most people. Everything has become commodified in the United States, from housing to healthcare to education to art. Everything has a price tag on it. And when I was a kid, growing up in the 60s, I was fat. And so if you were fat when you were young, you tended to make fun of people who were fat when you were a teenager. My mother would say, don't do that. That's not nice. They probably have a thyroid problem. Well, today, seriously, you wouldn't say they have a thyroid problem. They have an eating problem. They have a food nation problem. And a friend of mine who's a therapist who deals with people who have obesity, she says one of the biggest issues they struggle with is shame on a daily basis. And so what you see are these divisions and cleavages in the United States that the system with power, either explicitly or through efficiency, has created. And the proverbial chickens are coming home to roost. And there's deepening division because, I think maybe you said it earlier now, is blue-collar white Americans are now playing the victim card. And it's not like they're making, some of them, Steve Bannon and many others, are actually very explicitly making that a strategic play.
Can I just say, they are victims with assault weapons. They didn't look like every other victim, but I agree, I take what you're saying.
I would say not the vast majority. But here's the thing, is the reality is I look at my country through the lens of how I would go in and analyze another country. It's difficult on a personal basis because I came to realize that I was at a safe emotional distance the last 25 years, pushing friends and others around the world to reconcile with their enemies, to make peace with the people who created apartheid or who did horrible things. But when it comes to my country, I realize how difficult it is, how emotionally difficult it is. And I just want to say one final thing, is that you cannot really address whether it's racism in America and the context of not representing all these other divisions and fault lines that are happening. And they're real.
I want us to come back, but I want to bring the audience at this point exactly, because I can see the temperature rising. But I don't want us to forget something that you said, Bonnie, which is absolutely crucial. You pointed out that the President of the United States has taken a side. And if that is the case, we need to ask ourselves, why are we and our media and our politicians giving him the benefit of the doubt? That's one question that
I don't think that
bothers
happens
me.
anymore.
I'm not certain. The other side of that is, many of my journalist friends, and particularly in America, have placed their faith in the democratic apparatus, that somehow the separation of powers and so on and so forth are going to save them, and
Oscar,
they're going
but
to
the
get
media
maybe.
created Trump.
Precisely.
I mean, they've made millions,
Precisely.
billions off of Donald J. Trump for the last 30 years. There's no way they weren't going to invest in Donald Trump. There was no way they weren't going to let this play out. This is like a horrible fairy tale. They didn't think the guy was going to win. That's basically what it was. Hillary was boring and dull and whatever she was, and they were going to let Donald Trump romp through, and then they woke up the next day and, oh my fucking God, he's actually the president of the United
Which
States.
is his response as well.
Exactly.
That's exactly the point. It reminds me of a probably the best short story ever written by Augusto Monterroso. When I woke up, the dinosaur was still there. Only that it wasn't a dinosaur but a cockroach.
They made billions off him.
Let me please invite the audience at this point. Yes, over there. Do we have a microphone over here? The fourth row.
My God, Louis, look at you.
I know, he's big.
I don't think we can blame Trump for any of this. I think it's just been institutional racism for donkey's years, from when the black man that got beaten by the police in Los Angeles, they should have been jailed. All the policemen that did they should have all been charged, they should have been jailed, and they should have come down a bit more strongly. And it's institutionalized, it's in the families, education, social problems, health problems, and it should have been hammered years ago. It should have been a bit firmer with them. It's Trump, he's just a
He's
product.
a symptom, not a cause.
I'm not so convinced that the Civil War, the Northern War of Aggression, whatever one terms it, the rebellion, was lost by the South. I thought that with the assassination of Lincoln and the emergence of President Johnson, the Jim Crow laws, the quick re-establishment of the South, of the whites in the South, it really delayed civil rights for 100 years in America. And I feel that this persona of the poor white man is really very unhelpful historically. And I found myself in the 1970s being big into rock music, getting into the band and listening to The Night They Drove Old Dixie Down, and suddenly realizing I was being seduced by what I think Bonnie and Oscar have referred to as the romance.
That's right, baby, the romance of the West. And the romance of the South. Yeah.
Well, there was also
And,
Leonard Skinner.
The Leonard Skinner, the whole thing.
So it's right here in our bones, and I just think that that's part of the tragedy that we're seeing now. It was never properly dealt with in 1865, and it's continued to this day. And fresh from seeing Detroit last night and coming here to hear this today, it feels rather bleak.
And Trump just pardoned Sheriff Apple, didn't he?
He did what?
he pardoned these.
He did it today?
Yeah.
He did it, right. Of course, because,
But do we not see the same narrative of romance being played out in lots of settler communities, white Kenya, the Boers? We do see it being played out in other places. It isn't actually, I think, uniquely an American story.
Well, what I would say is the other side of that, I totally agree with that, but the other side of that is there are as many American dreams as there are Americans. That's our birthright. We're all born to dream. That's what we're supposed to do. And so in the 1960s, when I was coming of age and then starting to go to university, the American dream, I mean, Dr. King's, sort of a promptu remark at the end of the March on Washington was, I have a dream. So you always have the dreams. Always dreams are competing. So the dream that was for the last 20 or 30, last 40 years, has been a dream of ethnic minority empowerment, being able to, my generation at university, we sat in on the dean's offices and we closed the schools down so that, Barack Obama could go to Harvard Law School. That's really what happened. But what the other part of is when you dream one dream, somebody else's dream ain't gonna happen. And what's happened now is when the generation, Barack and Michelle Obama's generation, people born in the middle of the 60s who were able to go and take advantage of university at the end of the 70s and 80s when I couldn't do it because we the things weren't there to happen. When they got in there, it excluded somebody else. And what's happened is, and I think the bottom line is that the conversation, the whatever, it didn't really happen. The guys, white guys who walk down the street with Kalashnikovs need to be in the jailhouse. They're not going to get in the jailhouse because the people who are supposed to lock them up are part of the whole narrative that they're a part of. So it's a competing narrative, dream world, dream thingy, and we stop dreaming, we can actually start to deal with this, and we're still dreaming.
Right. It's a shame that Ibrahim Rasool is not up here on the panel, but you'll have a chance to hear from him tomorrow and later. And you should ask him some of these questions from South Africa. But there was a line from Nelson Mandela who says, you have to deal with the world as you find it. And that's always been, I'm an optimist by nature, a pessimist by experience sometimes. But I look at this issue in the United States, and you look at the statistics. The majority of white people in the United States don't have a friend of color.
They don't. It's true.
In Boston, the cradle of liberty, where the abolitionist movement started, the Federal Reserve Bank of Boston did a study 2 years ago. The average household wealth of a white family is $248,000. For a Dominican or Latino family, it's $3,000. But for an African American family, it's $8. The Brookings Institution did a study on inequality in the United States. And Boston, and you can tell I'm not proud of these reports, has the greatest inequality of wealth, partly driven by the great concentration of wealth in life sciences and the universities and these other communities. So when you look at this, and there are some other frightening statistics, that you can go in one city councilor's district where a lot of the universities are, to parts of Mattapan and Roxbury, which are primarily people of color, life expectancy drops 30 years. We have an opioid crisis in the United States. And it turns out it impacts mostly white people, blue collar, and some scientists I know, some researchers found that it impacts people of color much less, if not at all. Why? Because when they go to the hospital, the doctors don't treat them with pain medication because they make an assumption that they can handle the pain.
Their threshold is higher as
Their
well.
pain threshold is higher, and therefore they're not suffering as much.
Yep.
So these are really profound ways of thinking. And the reality is not everybody makes these choices because they've made a bigoted racist choice. So we need to know the difference between people who are making explicit choices like those who go to Charlottesville, and as fucked up as they are, to quote you, to those people who are clueless.
And that's most people.
And it's most people. So this is a huge challenge. And so rather than walk away, people who are white like me stand back and say, well, what do we do about this? What works and doesn't work? So in my city, when I go to mostly African American leaders who've been around for a long time, they're tired. And they say, but it's actually up to you and your folks to make it work. Because they said, you know, until people of power and privilege get it. Because they say, you know, every corporation has their affirmative action program, or they talk about diversity inclusion, but it's over in the silo called human resources or compliance. It's in the feel-good category. You know, and we point out inclusion and diversity are related but very different things. Inclusion is that subjective feeling of belonging. We all know what it feels like to belong. And there's even research that shows that 50% of workforces in private companies of color who get hired don't last more than 3 or 4 years because they don't feel included. And so one of the things we're looking at is, well, how do you redefine what inclusion is? How do you make it inclusive so that everybody, white, black, Latino, Asian American, Islamic, you name it, understands what it is to be excluded?
I don't understand, though, what motivation the people who have all the toys would have to share them. That's what I don't understand. Just one moment, because when you talked earlier on, you were talking about, and I guess you work mostly in post-conflict situations. Of course, America is still a pre-conflict situation from where it could possibly go. What motivation? You know, once you've had a war, there is a motivation to reconcile. There is a motivation to talk to your enemy. At this point where America is, and as Bonnie said, the president has chosen sides, what motivation do those people who stand to lose their great big bag of goodies have to engage? I mean, I don't dispute,
I think it's
I don't dispute
human
what you're
decency.
saying, but
Human
it's not on
decency.
show.
Guys,
It's not
please
on show.
behave. We're gonna have to finish.
That's wrong.
But I didn't want the white man to have the last word. So thanks for that. I mean,
Well, I do want to say, though, it's very simple. It's called human dignity.
No,
But
but
it's
even,
not
let,
on
let, me,
show.
let me have
You
the last
see?
word and say what the motivation is America's own bullshit myth. That's its motivation. Every American grows up saying blah, blah, da, da, da. We all do it. That's the motivation. We have never been honest. We have never been honest as a nation with how the nation was founded, with what we continue to do. And we never have. And I mean, I brought up that about Vietnam, which is my most recent war. That was a bloody defeat. Our butts were kicked. And you never, ever get in the United States that these people who were not armed, who didn't have nothing, ran the United States of America out on its heels, grabbing the ends of a helicopter, trying to get the hell out. That's what we don't get taught that. We don't get taught that. We don't get taught that what happened in the Revolutionary War wasn't necessarily about we got rid of the king. It was about the fact that we stole land. We stole land from Native Americans. We displaced people. That's never taught in America. And when people really start to get our history, maybe some people will actually wake up, be a little bit ashamed, and think, yeah, let's try and live up to some of this stuff. And the other thing I want to say is that the people who elected Trump were white women. They were the edge, okay, because they didn't think white women were going to come out for Trump like that, and they did, 53%. And what I'm saying is, and a lot of white women are dealing with this now, they need to go home. They need to go home, go to the dinner table, sit down with their menfolk and their boys and say, what's going on? What's going on? Because when it starts at home with women take that responsibility, a lot of this crap is going to stop.
so it is time. It is time. It isn't the time to finish. This is where it begins. It is time to wake up because the shit has hit the fan. To quote, I don't know who. Please join me in appreciation of 3 wonderful, amazing
Thank you,
speakers.
too.